Today, we're diving deep into auto sampling on the Akai Force and MPC. The auto sampler is a script that helps you create key group instruments by sampling sounds from external or internal synthesizers. Now, the auto sampler is not an artificial intelligence, it's just a script. It knows nothing about the sound you're sampling or how you intend to use it. Because of this, it can be a little bit intimidating at first. But if you give it a good set of instructions, it can take most of the tedious work out of creating great sounding and highly optimized key groups. The auto sampler does the work, and you provide the intelligence. In order to use the auto sampler effectively and get good results, we need to understand two things. One of those things is the characteristics of the sound that we're sampling. More on that in a bit. The second, and this is equally important, is understanding why we're creating the key group and how we intend to use it. Understanding both of these things will allow us to create a plan to auto-sample quickly and effectively. Let's start by talking about some different uses for the auto sampler. Some of these might be familiar to you, maybe they're even obvious. I hope that a few of these ideas will give you some new inspiration because the auto sampler can be a powerful tool for helping you create. Maybe in some ways you haven't thought about yet. The first use case I like to call preservation. This is the use case I think that most everyone commonly associates with the auto sampler. I want to sample the best sounds from that synth over there so that I can sell it and buy a shiny new one. But preservation can also include some other scenarios. For example, maybe you've created a complex sound on a modular synth and you know that once you unpatch it, you'll never get back to that sound again. If you're a modular synthesist, I bet this sounds familiar to you. With auto sampling, you can capture that fleeting patch into a playable instrument that's preserved forever. Another use case is increasing polyphony. What if you have a mono synth and you'd like to play some chords with the sounds in it? Or maybe you'd like to play an arpeggio or freeform and have each new note overlap the tail of the next one. Creating a key group using the auto sampler can expand the polyphony of voice-limited synths. Another reason is convenience. Sometimes it's just convenient to have a sound natively on your Force or MPC, even if you're not planning to sell that synth that makes the sound. Some synths are big and heavy, and it can be a hassle or even impossible to carry them to the studio, a friend's house, or take them on a camping trip, or even use them on the sofa. Next up is optimization. Like every digital device, your Force or MPC has some limitations. For some track types, such as plugins and audio tracks, there's a hard limit on how many you can have in a project. You're also constrained by the speed of your CPU and available RAM and memory. Even though we can push these devices pretty far, you still might find yourself up against one of these limits in a larger project. Well-designed key groups can be extremely efficient and help you free up and reallocate these resources so that you can finish your project. The last reason on my list is creativity. Key groups are one of the real creative superpowers inside your Force or MPC. When creating complex key groups from scratch, a strong command of the auto sampler can save a lot of time and manual work, and let us explore creative instrument ideas more quickly. So that's our goal today, to make you an auto sampling wizard to help you make music more creatively. Now that we understand the various reasons we might want to use the auto sampler, we can start to formulate our plan of attack for creating a great set of samples. The auto sampler requires some inputs before it can do its thing. If you've used the auto sampler before and you've been guessing at the values on the auto sampler screen, you've probably got some very mixed results and possibly some very bad results. Maybe it even made you give up in frustration. But don't worry, you don't have to guess at any of these values. I'm going to show you exactly how to determine what values to feed the auto sampler. By taking just a few minutes to do some detective work and making a plan, you can get a good set of samples that will work well for your intended use case the first time. You'll also minimize the work you need to do to the key group in order to finish it off. As usual, we'll do this by walking through some examples, explaining each thing that we need to investigate, what our decision points are, and how to make the best decisions to create the optimal key group for our needs. The truth is that auto sampling is a bit of a dance. It's a series of trade-offs. The perfect auto-sampled key group would sound absolutely identical to the source in every way, for every note. Even a computer analysis wouldn't be able to determine any differences. The perfect key group would also be extremely small in size, so as to load up instantly and consume no RAM memory. But auto-sampled key groups aren't quite perfect. Each of these ideals is in conflict with one another, and we can't really have it both ways. So our goal is to find the best balance between these things: sound quality and size. Let's dig in. Okay, we're going to begin by auto-sampling this ASM Hydrosynth that I have sitting over here, and I've got this cool bass patch dialed up. It sounds like this. And we'd like to create an auto-sample of this. So I've just added a MIDI track over here on the Force. This is a completely empty project. And actually, before we get started, let's just jump over here into the menu and take a look at our system resources with an empty system. You can see that we're hovering somewhere around 5% CPU and 0% memory usage. So that's just a good baseline for us to understand after we create our key group how many resources they're taking up. So if we come in here, I'm just going to set the output port to be the Hydrosynth so that we can play the Hydrosynth from here. And then I'll bring up the auto sampler, or the sampler. I do have this run directly into the back of the Force, into the two inputs here. And so I've got this set to input 1 and 2 right now. I'm actually wondering if this would make sense as a mono sound. I didn't hear any stereo type effects on it when I played it, so let's just give that a try. That'll actually reduce the size of our samples if we can reduce them to stereo or to mono. And we need to turn the input monitoring on here if it's not already on. And for this, I just like to have my notes starting on the root just to help me kind of visualize where I'm at. I think this is going to work fine in mono. The only other thing we really need to do is get the levels right here. So just looking at the level meter, we want to make sure that nothing goes above 0 dB or clips up there. Somewhere in the -3 to 0 range is probably a good place to target. And I can either make this adjustment over here on the Hydrosynth, or I can use the trim knobs in the back of the Force to turn the volume up a bit if I want. That looks fine to me. So let's open up the auto sampler and see what kind of questions it's going to ask us. You can see here we've got the track name, MIDI 1, and that's the track that I'm on right here. And we need to start on the track that we want to be sending the note data from, because we're not going to be able to change that here. Taken from the sampler, we're going to be recording from input 1. And our first decision point is this note range here, which defaults to C2 to C4. And what I want to do is test that out and make sure that that is a reasonable range, and if not, change it. So one thing that I like to do is to come into the menu here and open up the MIDI monitor and click on out here, and we can just kind of clear it out. And this gives us a really good visual of what notes we're actually sending. So that's a C2 note you can see right here. And I like that note, that sounds good. If I go down an octave to C1, that actually sounds a lot like flatulence to me, so I don't think I need to sample down that far. I think that C2 is probably going to be a pretty good starting point. C3 still sounds very usable. C4 sounds very usable as well, although in terms of a bass patch, I don't know that I would go much higher than that. Now, it's true what they say, that some bass sounds can make good lead sounds if you play them up higher in the register, right? So I'm not really hearing anything spectacular there that I would want to use as a lead sound. But if I did, I would strongly consider actually making two key groups out of this, one for a bass and one for the lead sound if we wanted to use some higher up registers. And that'll just kind of allow us to minimize the number of samples that we need to take per key group so that they're more efficient. We probably wouldn't be using it as both a lead and a bass at the same time. So I think I'm going to sample from C2 to C4. So if we come back into the auto sampler, that looks like it's already good to go. The next thing we have here is note stride. So this is basically saying how many notes we're going to skip before we take a sample. So if we start down here on C2, we'd go 1, 2, 3, well actually these are whole tones. These are semitones here. So this is actually going to correspond 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to an F sharp. So what that means is that this sample that we take on C is going to get stretched all the way up to this F note here. And generally, I think 6 is a pretty good going in position, unless you can find a reason that it won't work for you. The force works to change these pitches by playing the samples faster. So in some cases, this isn't going to work too well, but for a lot of sounds, I think 6 is going to actually sound pretty good and give us a nice balance between sound quality and size. So we'll just start there. We've got this option to extend min-max notes, and essentially what that means is that if, let's say this note right here, C4 that I take as my last sample, normally that would extend up to an F note here, but we're saying that we're going to go ahead and extend this to go all on up, all the way up here. Now the further you get away from the sample, it's probably not going to sound that good, but at least you won't have any notes that don't make any sound. Some reasons that I can think of to maybe turn this off: if you're creating a key group that's going to do like a key split or something like that, and you have other samples that you intend to put in the different key ranges, that might be a good reason to turn this off. The only other reason I can think of, it might just be a good reminder that that's where your last sample is. For now, we'll just go ahead and leave it on. The next decision point here are the velocity layers. So what we need to do is figure out if we need to take more than one sample per velocity layer, or whether one will work. So let's go take a look at that. One thing I like to do here is to use this tool. If you come in here plus shift notes, we have some options for velocity. We are on as played right now, but we can actually set specific velocities in here. And that's a little more scientific, I guess, than just trying to hit your keyboard or whatever at different strengths, because you don't know exactly what velocity you're sending. But here you do. I'm always going to be sending 12% velocity. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through and I'm going to listen to these notes at different velocities. And what I'm trying to determine is there anything that's changing as I change velocities other than the volume of the note? If it's only the volume that's changing, we'll be able to recreate that easily in the force, and we don't really need to take any additional samples and take up room with those in order to be able to do that. So let's give it a go. I'm definitely hearing some differences there, other than volume. I'm hearing it get brighter and maybe changing its wavetable shape. This is a wavetable synth as we go at it with higher and higher velocities. So I think in this case, we're going to want to take all 4 samples. Now, by default, it's set up to do them in splits of 4, so 25%, 50%, 75%. Let's just make sure that that's also going to sound good. Yeah, and I think that is going to be great, actually. Seems like we're getting a good representation of the different sounds at those 4 velocity levels. So if I come back into the auto sampler, we're already set up, like I said, to do it at divisions of 1/4 of the range. So all we need to do in this case is turn these 4 layers on. We don't really need to make any adjustments to them. By the way, you'll notice I'm jumping in and out of the auto sampler screen, and it does do a really good job of retaining the values that you put in here as you jump in and out of it. The only thing I don't think it retains is this base name right here, so save that for last. Anyway, the next thing we're going to take a look at is the sampling section, and here's where we have to determine how long our note is, as well as if we want to loop it. So we're going to use some different tools for that. Let's cancel out of here, and we'll just come back in and go to the regular sampler. And I think it's a really good idea, if you're going to be taking a lot of samples with the auto sampler, to just take one sample manually and have a good look at it and really see what you're dealing with. So let's do that. Let's make sure we've got plenty of time set up here. And I'll just go ahead and record arm this, and I'm just going to record one single sample. I can go ahead and hit stop, and when I'm done, I don't need to change anything. I'll just hit edit down here, and we'll go in and actually take a look at this sample. If I press on this headphones icon here, I can use my finger to preview the sound. And one thing about the sound I notice on the Hydrosynth when I'm playing it, or from here, as soon as I release the note, it's gone. So there's really no kind of release section or decay for this note. It just disappears immediately as soon as I release the key. So we don't have to worry about any kind of tail or anything like that. So we're just going to be focusing on the sample length and whether we need to loop it. So one of the great ways to do this is to come into the sample pad edit mode. And here we can play around with some loops and figuring out the sample length. You're going to notice that the timeline up here is in samples. So if I press this cogwheel right here, we can switch the units of this into time. And now you'll see it's very tiny, but it's displaying in seconds. So that's going to be helpful because that's the units of measure that the auto sampler wants us to input these values in. So let's go ahead and try to set up some loop points here. I'm going to turn the loop lock off, and I'm going to set this to loop forward. I'm also going to throw my knobs into screen mode for convenience. And let's just take some guesses at what a good sample might be. So I'm going to move the loop point over here, and what I'm going to try to find here is a section of the sample that I can kind of loop over and over without it sounding different. So I'll bring my end point back here some. And I'm trying to find a section here where the volume doesn't change too much. Let's try maybe right about in here. So we've actually got some convenient keys down here on the bottom that help us do a lot of different things. And this is in your user manual. If you haven't looked at it, it tells you what these different keys do. And one that's really useful here is this play loop continuous on pad 16. So you can hear that that's got some clicks in it. And what I'm going to try to do is address those by using a crossfade. Now, the crossfade value here is going to actually be in samples. And I'm using the Force's internal sound card. So the sampling rate is 48,000 hertz, which means that a value of 48,000 in the X fade would be a crossfade of 1 second. We've also got a couple of options for this crossfade. We've got equal power and linear, which is up above it, and you can kind of see there's a little diagram of what those kind of look like. I'm going to start with equal power, and let's just try to put a crossfade in here. And I think that that's sounding pretty good. One of the other keys on here allows me to play the full sample, including the loop. I think it is this one right here, play sample note on. And I'm hearing just a little bit of volume fluctuation in there, so maybe we can adjust the loop point back a little bit. And maybe bring this crossfade up just a little bit more. And I think that's going to sound good. Perfect. So if we go take a look, let's take a look at like the end point here. And if that's the last one that I've moved, when I zoom in, it will zoom in on the end point. So we can actually get a good read on what those time values are. It looks like it's at about 5,100 milliseconds, 5.1 seconds. So I'm just going to jot that down here. And if we go take a look at the loop point, we'll jump back to there, and we can see that that is at let's just call that 4 seconds. I'll jot that down. So because, like I said, this sample ends as soon as you release the key, we don't really need to sample at all past this endpoint. We can just cut it off wherever we're finished there. So let's jump back into the auto sampler, and we can go ahead and put these values in. So our sample length, we just said it's going to be at 5.1 seconds or 5100 milliseconds. We don't need any tail in this case. There's no release on this sound. And for the looping, we had it set to forward, and we had the loop point at 4 seconds. And we had the loop end all the way at the end at 5100 milliseconds. That's as far as it will let me go. We had the crossfade set to, I think it was right around 42,000. And we had it set to equal power. We've got this option here for auto trim start, and what that will do is just remove any silence at the beginning of the sample that might have been caused by latency from the round trip of the MIDI to audio and back. I usually leave that checked. And on completion, we can make this the current track. And at the very bottom, we have an estimate of how long this is going to take to complete, 81 seconds. So I think all that sounds pretty good. One thing that I kind of like to do just before we take this final sample that's going to take quite a while, let me uncheck these layers real quick. And let's just come back here and sample a very small range. So I'm just going to do C2 to C3 with one velocity layer. And you can see now down at the bottom, that's going to reduce my sample time to 10 seconds. But I do still want to leave the looping and things like that on. And I just want to make sure that all of these values that we picked are going to work out well, that the stride value is okay and the notes are going to sound okay, and that loop's going to work. So let's just go ahead and take this very short auto sample. Okay, so you can see it's created a new track. It just named it whatever I had the base name set to, which I didn't name it in this case. And we've already got this track selected. So let's take a listen. It sounds to me like our loop is fine there. And the other thing I wanted to test was just to make sure that the stride worked okay. So here's our sample, and this note. And all of those notes sound fine to me. I don't think that stretching them hurt them in any way in this case. So I think we're really good to go here. Let's go ahead and we'll delete this track that we just created. And if we want to, we can come back up into the project settings. You can see the samples we recorded, and we can purge these now unused samples. From there, we can jump back to the auto sampler. And let's just go ahead and turn our other options back on. So we'll turn on all of these velocity layers. And we'll go ahead and set the range to go back up to C4. And the final thing I think I actually want to do is name this track. So this is coming from the Hydro Synth. And this patch was called In Yo Face Bass. So let's name it that. And let's go. All right. It's completed, so let's check out what we've created and see if it sounds okay. I actually prefer to play from the keyboard, so let me jump over here. I'll turn the volume down on here just to prove that we're not actually playing the Hydro Synth. It sounds good. I think there's just a couple of tweaks that we need to make to the key group. So first of all, let's come in here and edit this key group. And we can see here that the polyphony is set to 16 for the key group. And actually, this is a monophonic patch on the Hydro Synth. It's a bass sound. So let's go ahead and change that one and set this down to mono, just like the original. Another thing we might want to take a look at changing, if I play this original patch, I noticed that there were no volume changes from different velocities. It just changed timbre. And by default, the force is going to be set up to change the volume in response to velocity. So I think in this case, we can go ahead and turn that off. So I think this sounds great. Let's take a look at our memory and CPU usage. As I play, let's see what the CPU changes. You'll recall the memory started at 5% CPU. We're actually still at 5% CPU, and we've only used 2% of our available RAM. So you can see that this key group is very efficient. It really is hardly using any CPU at all, and it's barely using any of our RAM. We could have a ton of these key groups and still have a lot of room to do other things. Now, I will admit that that did take a little bit of work to find the different loop points and things like that, but it wasn't that bad. It didn't really take very long. We do always have the option in the auto sampler of taking more of a brute force approach. And what do I mean by that? So, for example, we could turn all of this looping off, and then we could just set this note length to be as long as we would ever expect to hold the note down. And what that's ultimately going to do is create longer samples. But it's quicker and easier to set up. We could also set this note stride so that we didn't have to worry about it sounding any different at all. We could set this down to 1. And I just kind of wanted to show you an example of what that looks like. I'm not going to actually set that up for you, but let me just load the key group that I've already saved this way. So here's the key group that I made earlier. It's called Face Bass LG for large. So I think I made each of these samples 4 seconds long, which may or may not be as long as I actually want to play them. And I sampled every key. So let's just look how long this takes to load up and look at what resources it takes up as I load it over top of the other key group. And if we pop back and look at the memory and CPU usage, CPU is still the same, but we've jumped from 2% of our memory to 11% of our memory. So how many key groups like that could I have? Not nearly as many. So I think you get a little bit of an idea of the balance here. As I played through a patch where I did this sort of brute force sampling, and one where I took the time to do the looping, like I said, it did take me a little bit longer to set the loops up, but I could have a lot more of those key groups than I could of these. I could have probably only eight more of these and my RAM would be full. All right, let's check out this next sound, which has several challenges to overcome in it. This is another patch on the Hydra synth, and it's called Metalworks. It sounds like this. So the first thing I noticed about this patch is that it has a little bit of reverb on it. And one thing I would recommend is on your source synth, consider disabling time-based effects like delays and reverbs. The advantage that'll give you, it'll actually let you have a slightly shorter tail. You don't need to record that reverb or delay tail on the force. So that'll make a slightly smaller sample and take up slightly less RAM. But maybe the even bigger advantage is that if you do it this way, you can actually go back and add these effects on the force, delays and reverbs, and then you have the flexibility to change them after the fact. You can change the delay time or the reverb time or the amounts. Whereas if you record that delay or reverb in from the source synth, it's pretty much hard locked in there. You can't really alter it afterward. So it's not always possible, but it's something to consider. It's just disabling those time-based effects in the destination synth. So let's see here. Some other challenge this sound has, is that it's rhythmic. So if we take a look, I actually recorded a single sample of this, and I set some loop points. What I did differently from the last time is I turned the loop lock on. That just has this with a start point and an end point. There's no loop point that's different from the start point. And we can actually find a spot in this sample where we just loop from beginning to end, and it sounds good. Just like that. So we figured this out the same way we figured out on the bass patch we did before. If we come back into the auto sampler, I've already got it set up to record exactly what we need here. So we'll just review that real quick. I'm doing a very small range, C2 to 3. I'm doing a 6-note stride. This is going to be a problem, and I want to show you why. We're just doing one velocity layer. I've got my note length set to 1100, and there is a tail on this sound when you release it. So I set that to 1 second just to catch that tail. We're doing forward looping, and we're starting at 0 and going to 1100. No crossfade on this one because it is rhythmic. And everything else looks good. Let's go ahead and just record that quick sample. We'll show you what the stride does. All right, so let's play this sound. The first thing you can hear there is that the looping is a little bit off. But let's check out some higher notes. Let's check out this one compared to this one. Do you hear how much faster it is? And that's because we sampled every 6 notes, and the Force does these notes by speeding the sample up. So as we speed the sample up, that rhythmic part is going to get faster. So that's no good. Let's go ahead and delete that track. And I'll just go ahead and purge all the unused samples in here. And let's come back and try this. This is one of those sounds where we're actually going to have to set the note stride all the way down to 1 to preserve that rhythmic value. So this is going to take a few more samples. It's going to take a little bit longer, but only 25 seconds for this 1 octave range. So we'll go ahead and do it. And let's check out what we got this time. All right, so that sounds much better. Now our rhythm is at the same rhythm across all the keys that we sampled, so that's great. But we do have some problems with the loops, and one of the reasons is that this auto sampler, if we go look at it, when we set up the looping in here, it really doesn't let us get very specific, right? It only lets us loop in increments of 100 milliseconds, which is 1/10 of a second. So we weren't able to get those samples exactly right on. We're going to have to go back and modify these a little bit. So if I come into the key group properties, this is going to be pretty easy to do. I've just got my notes in my knobs in screen mode to make this a little bit easier, and I think probably the 100 knob is going to be the best fit for this. So let me just start out on this sample, and I'll just bring that back a little bit. And then I can move on to the next one, and I'll just bring this sample back a little bit. And the same for each of these. I won't do them all to save some time, but you get the idea. So now these can all be looped really well. You can dial these in exactly like you need to. The other thing we need to do to this is we didn't capture that release. So if I come over here to the envelopes, all we need to do is set the key group to all. And then we can adjust the release time on this a little bit so that we get that kind of ringing out afterward. So let's bring this up. That sounds about right. I think the other thing I might do with this one, even though it's actually a polyphonic patch on the Hydra, I might just turn this down to mono. So great, that was a pretty challenging one. Really the only thing we might need to do is add that little bit of reverb back. So if I come over to the mixer, I would probably prefer to set this up as a send effect. So if I hit the master button here, and we come over to the effects on return 1, in the empty project, there's already a reverb set up on here. I would just need to dial this in to my liking, and then I could come back to the regular channel tracks and go to sends. And for this one, I could just turn this send amount up however much I needed it and adjust from there. And that's quite a bit. It was pretty light on the original patch. So just dial that into taste. So now let's talk about a very different kind of sound. I've got the DeepMind 12 out here, and this patch is called Tundra Rd. I think that stands for Richard Devine, who's actually a very famous sound designer. So let's listen to this sound. Up until now, we've basically been talking about trying to optimize these key groups that are created by the auto sampler as much as possible. But sometimes it's just not possible, and this is a really good example of a sound like that. If I pop over here to the effects section, you can see we've got some really complex stuff going on here with the routing. We've actually got the sound going into a chorus and then into a chamber reverb. And that sound is actually fed back through a delay and into a pitch shifter, and then it comes back in before the reverb. So that's what's really kind of creating this glimmering kind of reverb sound. As of right now, in February 2023, the Force wouldn't really be able to recreate this. It doesn't have these kind of feedback routing constructs in the effects section. So we're really not going to have much choice but to sample the sound at its full length. And also, if you listen to the sound, it is on this time delay, so the glimmer effect is kind of stepping through pitches, and we're probably not going to be able to sample this with any stride greater than 1 either. So let's take a listen to the sound if I just turn the reverb off. You can hear there's almost nothing to it. So it's really this sound, the effects are the sound. Let's take a look at sampling this one. All right, so I've completed this auto sample. You can see that I've done it for a very short range here, just C2 to G2. The note stride was 1. We just did 1 layer at 127. And down here you can see I set the note length to 1.5 seconds and the tail all the way out to 20 seconds. That's when I did my investigation. I found out that's about how far I have to go just to make sure that I capture that entire huge reverb tail. The looping was off. We went ahead and auto trimmed the start. And I went ahead and took the sample, and just for that series of notes, it took 150 seconds. So let's actually go look at the track that was created here. And it sounds good. One thing we may want to do to this one, because this is such a long note, I don't want to sit here and have to hold it. So let's come into the key group settings and on the global, and we'll just make sure that we're set to all key groups. And let's change this from note on to 1 shot for the sample play. So it sounds really good. You can see that this took up 7% of my sample memory just to do this. So this is really kind of one of these worst case kind of auto sampling scenarios, I would say. But you may run across some stuff like this, and just kind of wanted to give you some things to look for to know when you are actually in this situation. So at this point, I think I've given you all of my best tips for creating great auto samples. You could use these for all of the reasons that we talked about in the beginning of the video. One thing we didn't really get into too much was the creativity aspect of it all. And that is actually not going to fit in this video, so I'm going to have to do another one on creative uses for key groups. But I think this is going to be a great resource for getting started when we get to that video. I hope you've learned something. If you've enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd give it a like. Thanks for that. And this is Joe. I'll catch you next time.